On my son's birthday, after 20 years of silence, he raised his glass across the crowded Christmas table and said, "It's so good to have you back in the family, Dad. Maybe now we can help you manage all that money of yours." The words cut through the warm chatter like a blade, and though the room erupted in polite laughter, I sat still, my hands folded on the polished oak table, watching the reflection of the chandelier tremble in my untouched glass of wine. He said it so casually, as though my absence for 2 decades was nothing more than a brief misunderstanding, as though the long nights I had spent waiting for his call, the endless Christmas mornings where I had stared at a silent phone, the birthdays marked only by the sound of my own breathing in an empty house, were minor inconveniences now that my bank account had grown fat. My son's voice carried that false cheer that comes when a man is playing to an audience, when he wants to appear gracious while hiding the hunger in his eyes. And in that moment, though I said nothing, I knew with cold certainty why I was sitting there among people who had long ago discarded me. It wasn't forgiveness they wanted. It was money. I let the silence stretch for a moment, my gaze fixed on a roasted turkey steaming at the center of the table, its skin gleaming under the light, its scent rich with butter and rosemary, while around it sat bowls of candied yams, glazed carrots, and stuffing dotted with cranberries. The smells filled the air, wrapping around me in an almost mocking warmth, reminding me of all the Christmases I had spent alone with nothing but a can of soup and the sound of the wind rattling my old windows. The clinking of forks and the rustle of napkins brought me back, and when I finally lifted my head, I caught my son watching me with that same forced smile, the kind that stretched his lips but left his eyes hard and calculating. "Go on, Dad," he urged, lifting his glass higher, coaxing me to clink it against his. "Here's to family and new beginnings." I raised my glass slowly, not because I wanted to, but because the moment demanded it, because the people seated around us were staring, waiting for a show, waiting for the picture-perfect scene of reconciliation. Our glasses touched with a sharp, hollow clink, and as I took a sip, I wondered how many of them knew the truth, that my invitation here was not born from love, but from greed, that the 20 years of silence had only ended when word spread that I was no longer the poor, forgotten man scraping by, but a wealthy one with assets they believed were ripe for the taking. As the meal began, my son leaned back in his chair, his arm draped casually around his wife, a woman who had never once spoken to me during all those years of exile, and he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "We were just talking the other day, Dad, about how complicated managing money can be. All those investments, properties, the taxes. It's a lot for one man. Maybe we could help you. Keep it all in the family, you know?" The guest chuckled, some nodding approvingly, as though he had just made a generous offer rather than revealed his hand like a gambler too eager to grab the pot. I felt a bitter smile tug at my lips, not because his words amused me, but because I saw the irony of it all so clearly. For 2 decades, I had been invisible to him, and now, suddenly, I was not only welcome but necessary, valuable, a man worth his time, because my net worth had climbed high enough to glitter in his eyes. I let him talk. I let him fill the air with his rehearsed charm, with stories about his work, his children, his plans for the future, each one salted with careful mentions of how expensive life had become, how much easier things would be if the family worked together. His words were baited hooks, cast into the waters of my patience, and I felt the tug of each one. But I refused to bite. I listened. I nodded occasionally. I even smiled once or twice, all while my mind played back the reel of the past. The day he slammed the door in my face after a heated argument about money I didn't have. The nights I left messages on his answering machine that were never returned. The letter I sent on his wedding day that came back unopened. Every moment of pain sharpened my focus, reminded me that this dinner was not a reunion. It was a transaction. The clatter of silverware filled the pauses between his words, and I noticed how his wife's eyes flicked toward me each time he mentioned money, her expression polite but sharp, like someone assessing the value of an estate before an auction. Their children, my grandchildren, who barely knew me, laughed and played with their cousins at the far end of the table, their innocence a painful contrast to the greed sitting beside me. I wanted to reach for them, to connect, to carve out something real in the mess of this performance. But I held back. This wasn't the time for sentiment. This was the stage where the first act of their manipulation played out, and I was content to watch, to let them think they were winning. When the plates were cleared and dessert was brought out, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, pecan pie glistening with syrup. My son raised a glass again, his cheeks flushed with wine and pride. "To Dad," he declared, his voice ringing with practiced emotion. "We're so glad to have you back, especially now that life has turned around for you. It's only right that we share it together. That's what family's about, right?" The words dripped with false sincerity, and I could feel the eyes around the table turn toward me, waiting for my response, waiting for me to stand up and declare that all was forgiven, that I was ready to hand over not just my heart but my fortune. Instead, I set my fork down carefully, folded my napkin, and said in a calm, steady voice, "Family is about a lot of things. Trust, loyalty, standing by each other when it matters most. Money doesn't make those things appear. It just shows who never cared about them to begin with." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. My son laughed nervously, waving his hand as though brushing off a speck of dust. "Of course, Dad, of course. That's what I meant. We all care about you. We just want what's best for you." But I could see in his eyes the flicker of irritation, the tightening of his jaw, the faint crack in the mask he had worn all evening. He knew I had heard the subtext beneath his words, and worse, he knew I wasn't going to play along the way he had expected. Still, he rallied quickly, steering the conversation back to lighter topics, but the tension lingered like smoke, invisible yet choking. As the night wore on and coffee was poured, I excused myself to the back porch, stepping into the cold winter air. The sky was a deep, starless black, the kind of night that swallowed sound, and I let the chill bite at my skin, grounding me in the moment. Behind me, the muffled laughter and clinking glasses carried on. But out here, I could finally breathe. I thought about the irony of it all, that I had once longed for nothing more than to hear my son call me Dad again, and now, hearing it after so many years, it sounded hollow, a word stripped of love and filled only with calculation. I leaned against the railing, my breath rising in pale clouds, and I whispered to myself, "This isn't love. This is business. And if it's business he wants, then business is what he'll get." When I stepped back inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around me once more, but I carried the cold of the night with me, the clarity of it settling into my bones. I rejoined the table, smiling politely as though nothing had shifted, and I listened as my son laid out his not-so-subtle vision for the future. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I simply watched and waited, knowing that this was only the beginning and that the real game was about to start. The next morning, I sat alone at the kitchen table of the small house I had bought for myself years earlier, a house that had become both a refuge and a reminder of solitude, its walls filled only with the echoes of my own footsteps and the ticking of the clock that seemed louder in the emptiness. The previous night's dinner replayed in my mind like a film reel I couldn't turn off, every gesture and every word magnified in the silence, especially the moment when my son leaned in, glass raised, voice loud enough for everyone to hear, declaring that family meant sharing money and managing it together. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just careless talk. It was a plan carefully stitched together, and the invitation to Christmas had been nothing more than the curtain rising on their performance. I looked around my kitchen, the morning light streaming in through the lace curtains I had hung myself, the smell of the coffee machine filling the air with the sharp scent of dark roast, and I thought back to the 20 years that had come before. My son had once been everything to me. I had raised him as best I could after his mother left, pouring every ounce of energy into making sure he never felt the absence, working 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to cover his schooling, his sports fees, his college dreams. I remember the smell of wet grass on Saturday mornings when I drove him to soccer games, the sweat-soaked jerseys I washed late at night, the countless hours sitting in bleachers, clapping until my palms stung, just so he'd know I was proud. I remembered scraping together money for his first car, a battered old Honda that I bought with borrowed cash, just so he wouldn't feel embarrassed when his friends were all driving something. But the memories soured as I followed them forward in time, because as he grew older, the gratitude faded, replaced by distance, criticism, and eventually silence. The arguments had started with money. He wanted more than I could give, and I was ashamed of the limits of my paycheck. He wanted to live like his wealthier friends, and when I told him that I simply couldn't keep up, his words cut deep. "You're a failure, Dad. You'll never have anything, and neither will I if I stay tied to you. That was the last real conversation we had before the silence began, before birthdays passed with no calls, before holidays came and went without a seat for me at his table. For 20 years, I learned to live with a wound, patching it over with work, routine, and eventually, with a stroke of luck that seemed like divine irony, an old investment, something I had nearly forgotten about, had finally matured in ways I never expected, and what had once been a few $1,000s tucked away became millions almost overnight. It was strange how quickly life could turn. One day I was budgeting carefully for groceries. The next day I was sitting with a financial advisor who called me sir and explained how trusts and estates worked. I had moved quietly, never flaunting my wealth, because after years of having so little, I knew money wasn't a banner to wave. It was a shield to hold close. But somehow my son found out. Maybe it was through mutual acquaintances, maybe through idle gossip, maybe through the subtle investigations of someone who suddenly had a reason to care. However it happened, the silence broke not with a phone call of love or reconciliation, but with an invitation to Christmas, the first I had received in 2 decades, neatly printed on cardstock with my name written carefully in his wife's handwriting. I remembered holding the envelope that day, my heart racing as though I were a boy again, desperate for acceptance, until the practical side of me whispered, "Why now?" Sitting at my kitchen table, sipping bitter coffee, I thought back to that moment and realized how naive it had been to believe, even briefly, that the invitation had been genuine. Last night I confirmed it. Their eagerness, their probing questions, their too-polished charm. My presence had not been about family at all. It had been about access. And what stung most was not the greed itself, but the sheer casualness with which it had been laid bare, as though 2 decades of abandonment could be erased with a toast and a thin smile. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and stared at the framed photographs on the wall. Most of them were old. Pictures of my son as a boy, a few of us together back when times were good, the kind of snapshots that freeze joy before it slips away. They looked almost foreign now, as if they belonged to another man's life, because the boy in those pictures had become a man who now looked at me like a bank account with a heartbeat. The contrast made my stomach twist, a sour taste rising in my throat, and I felt a wave of grief as sharp as the day I realized he had truly cut me out. But grief wasn't the only thing growing in me. There was something else, something harder, more precise. It was the understanding that the time for hoping had passed, that whatever innocence or love I had clung to was gone, replaced by a new kind of clarity. For years, I had been on the outside looking in, aching for a place at the table, but last night had shown me something unexpected. That being on the outside was not a weakness. It was an advantage. They had revealed their intentions too quickly, too eagerly, and I had seen the desperation behind their masks. That meant I had the power now, if I was willing to use it. Later that afternoon, I drove to the cemetery, a place I visited rarely, but always with the same heavy heart. The winter air was sharp, biting at my face as I walked the gravel path between rows of headstones, my breath visible in the cold. I found the stone I always sought, the grave of my own father, a man who had raised me with strict rules but unwavering loyalty, a man who had taught me that dignity was something no one could give you or take from you. You had to claim it for yourself. I stood there for a long time, my hands shoved into my coat pockets, the silence of the cemetery pressing around me like a blanket. "Dad," I whispered, the words catching the cold air, "I think you'd laugh if you could see this. All those years of nothing, and now he wants me back because I'm rich. Can you believe that? 20 years without a word, and now I'm suddenly family again." The wind rustled the bare branches above me, and I took it as the only answer I would get. I thought about the lessons my father had drilled into me, about pride, about strength, about never letting anyone treat you as less than what you are, and I realized that this was my moment to honor those lessons. If my son wanted to treat me like a business opportunity, then I would treat him like a negotiation, but it wouldn't be on his terms. It would be on mine. On the drive back, the city seemed sharper, the streets more vivid. Every passing face a reminder of how much life had changed since those years of silence. I thought about the times I had nearly begged him to speak to me, the nights I had written letters I never sent, the moments when I would see fathers and sons together and feel the ache in my chest like a knife. All of it had been built on the belief that love could still win, that time would soften his heart. But now I knew better. What I had witnessed at Christmas wasn't love softened by time. It was greed sharpened by opportunity. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the snow. I shut off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, the weight of decision settling on me. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing him that the years he had thrown away could not be rewritten with a single toast and a greedy smile. I stepped inside, the house warm and quiet, and I knew that the path ahead would not be simple. But for the first time in a long time, I felt steady, grounded, certain. He thought he had invited me back into his life to play the fool, to bankroll his dreams. But what he didn't know was that I had already begun planning, that every false word he spoke at that table had only tightened the knot of my resolve. I went to my desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write, not a letter of reconciliation, but notes, plans, steps. Because if this was the game he wanted, then I was ready to play, and I would make sure that by the end of it, he would learn the cost of 20 years of silence. When I got back from the cemetery, the air inside the house felt thicker than usual, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me with the weight of unspoken truths. And though I told myself to shake off the thoughts from the night before, they clung to me like wet clothes. I sat down in my armchair, the one that had molded to my body over the years, and let myself replay the dinner in painful detail, each moment slowing down until it was impossible to escape the reality that my son had not invited me there out of love, but out of hunger for the wealth he now believed was his inheritance. It was the way his eyes had darted across the table, the way his wife leaned in with questions that sounded polite but carried the sharp edge of calculation, asking about how many houses I owned now, whether I considered downsizing, and whether I thought about how difficult it might be to manage things alone at my age. I had smiled politely at the time, answering with vague phrases, but now, sitting alone, I felt the burn of those words deep in my chest, not just as casual inquiries, but as thinly veiled strategies, each designed to chip away at the idea that my independence was mine to keep. For a long time, I sat staring at the photograph of my son as a boy that hung on the wall opposite me. In it, he was maybe 8 years old, hair sticking out in all directions after a game of backyard baseball, grinning so wide his eyes nearly disappeared. I remembered the sound of his laughter that day, the way he had jumped into my arms, sweaty and dirty, saying, "Did you see that hit, Dad? I'm going to be the best one on the team." And I remembered answering, "Of course you are. Son, you always will be," believing every word as if it were gospel. The ache of that memory was almost unbearable because it collided so violently with the man I had faced at the dinner table. The same boy now grown into someone who looked at me not as his father, but as a wallet with a pulse. Someone who thought that 2 decades of silence could be erased with a smile and a toast. It was then that the grief hit hardest, not the grief of being used, but the grief of realizing that somewhere along the way, the boy I had raised had died, and in his place was a man who had no trouble discarding his father for 20 years, only to return when money became involved. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, though it was still early in the day, and let the burn of it coat my throat, hoping it might dull the ache in my chest. But the more I drank, the more vivid the memories became. I remembered the nights I had worked double shifts just to make sure he could go on the school trip to Washington, D.C., handing over the $450 fee in crumpled bills because it was all I could scrape together. I remembered the old winter coat I had worn for 5 years past its usefulness, so I could buy him the name-brand jacket he said all his friends had, watching his face light up as he tore open the box on Christmas morning, never telling him that my hands were cracked from the cold because I had put myself last. And most of all, I remember the silence that followed those sacrifices, the phone calls that went unanswered when he went off to college, the birthdays where my voicemail was the only witness to the songs I sang, the holidays where I cooked dinner for one, sitting at the table with the television playing in the background just to drown out the emptiness. For 2 decades, I had swallowed the pain, telling myself that maybe next year would be different, that maybe one day he'd pick up the phone and say, "Dad, I'm sorry I've missed you." But now I understood that it hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been busyness or oversight. It had been a choice. And the cruelty of that choice landed on me now with full force. I set the glass down, my hands trembling slightly, and leaned forward, elbows on my knees, staring at the floor as if it might hold an answer. The thought that kept circling my mind was simple but devastating. All those sacrifices, all those years of working, saving, and hoping had meant nothing to him. To me, they were the story of my life, proof of my love and commitment, but to him, they were invisible, forgotten, erased. It was as if the boy I had once known had taken all of those gifts, all of that love, and thrown it into the fire without a second thought. The longer I sat there, the more another feeling began to creep in beneath the grief, a feeling that at first I tried to resist, but that grew stronger with every passing minute. Anger. It started small like a spark, but it caught quickly, fueled by each memory of his neglect, each word from the dinner table that replayed in my head. "It's good to have you back in the family," he had said, raising his glass, and I realized now how hollow those words had been, how calculated, how rehearsed. He hadn't meant family. He had meant fortune. He hadn't meant welcome. He had meant possession. And that was when something shifted inside me. For years, I had carried the wound of abandonment like a scar across my heart, always assuming that the only way to heal was through reconciliation, through forgiveness. But now I saw the truth clearly. Forgiveness wasn't owed to someone who had never sought it. Reconciliation wasn't possible with someone who saw me only as a transaction. The wound would never heal if I kept reopening it with hope. The only way forward was to stop being a victim of his choices and start reclaiming my own power. I stood up then, pacing the living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, and let the anger build into resolve. He thought I was weak, thought I was desperate for his attention, thought that I would hand over my life's work just to hear the word, Dad, again. But he was wrong. He had underestimated the years I had spent alone, the strength I had built in silence, the patience that had been forged in rejection. What he had revealed to me at that Christmas dinner was not just his greed, but his blindness, and I realized now that blindness could be used against him. The thought gave me an odd sense of calm, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. I went back to my desk, pulled out the notes I had scribbled the night before, and began to expand them. No longer were they just vague ideas. They were a plan taking shape. I wrote down everything I remembered from the dinner, every hint he and his wife had dropped, every strategy they had employed to corner me. I listed the sacrifices I had made over the years, not because I needed to prove them to him anymore, but because I needed to remind myself of the truth. I had been the one who built this life, not him, and I would be damned if I let him tear it apart. By the time the sun set, the paper was filled with words, lines connecting to other lines, arrows pointing to steps I would take. My grief was still there, raw and heavy, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had become fuel, feeding the fire that now burned steadily in my chest. For the first time in 20 years, I wasn't thinking about how to win my son back. I was thinking about how to make sure he understood the cost of betraying me, the cost of choosing silence for 2 decades only to return with open hands. And as I sat back in my chair, exhausted but clear-headed, I realized that what I felt now wasn't just anger or grief. It was freedom. Freedom from the illusion that he might change. Freedom from the chains of waiting for a call that would never come. I had been trapped for over 20 years by hope, but now I was free, and with that freedom came a new purpose. To teach him, not through words but through actions, that the man he thought was weak was stronger than he could ever imagine. I didn't sleep much the night after I wrote out those pages, my mind racing in loops that began with the hurt of the past and ended with the anger of the present, only to circle back again until dawn peeked through the blinds and painted the room in a pale gray light that felt like both an ending and a beginning. My son's face haunted me, not the boy with the messy hair and baseball bat, but the man at the table with eyes calculating every word, every smile, every gesture. That face followed me into the kitchen as I brewed my coffee. The bitterness of it sharper than usual, and I sat there in the silence of my house, knowing something had shifted permanently. I wasn't going to let him walk over me. Not anymore. I pulled out the yellow legal pad I had left on the counter and flipped through the notes I had scribbled. Each line felt like a stab of reality, reminders of sacrifices made and years wasted. But it was the numbers that stopped me cold, the dollar signs attached to each memory. $4,500 for the Washington trip. $8,000 over 3 years for summer camps. $50,000 I had co-signed for his first home loan before he stopped returning calls altogether. Add to that the daily grind, the meals skipped, the late-night shifts, the mortgage I carried alone after his mother passed. The total figure wasn't just staggering. It was a lifetime carved into numbers, proof that every ounce of love had been backed by real sweat and sacrifice. And now he had the audacity to sit across from me and angle for more, as if 2 decades of absence had no price tag of its own. It wasn't just insulting, it was robbery, not of money, but of dignity, of memory, of the bond between father and son. That was when the resolve crystallized into something I could touch, something real and solid. If he saw me as a bank, then it was time to show him the vault was locked, sealed, and under my control. That morning, I drove into town and parked outside the attorney's office I had used years ago when I updated my will after the first big investment had paid off. The sign on the door was the same, though the gold paint on the letters had dulled. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of leather and old books, and the receptionist, a woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, looked up with surprise before greeting me warmly. "It's been a while, Mr. Hayes," she said, and I nodded, feeling the weight of the years in her words. When my attorney, Mark, finally ushered me into his office, the wood-panel walls and the heavy oak desk felt reassuring, like I was stepping into a fortress built for battles like mine. I told him everything, not sparing the painful details of the estrangement or the sudden reappearance now that money was involved. He listened carefully, pen scratching across his legal pad, his brow furrowing at times, and when I was done, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Samuel," he said slowly, "you've spent your life building something solid, and it's clear to me that your son sees that as a shortcut. But you don't owe him access just because of blood. You have options. You can lock down every asset, create trusts that bypass him entirely, and make sure your wealth goes exactly where you want it, to grandchildren, charities, whoever you choose. He won't see a dime unless you allow it." Hearing those words was like breathing clean air after years underground. I nodded, my chest tight but steady, and said, "That's exactly what I want. I've spent too long hoping for love in return for what I gave, and now I see that hope for what it is. A leash. I want that leash cut." We spent the next 2 hours drafting documents that would ensure my wealth was untouchable. Each signature I placed on the paper felt like a small act of liberation, the ink drying like chains falling away. Mark explained every step: irrevocable trusts, updated estate plans, protections against contested wills, and I listened with the focus of a soldier being trained for war. By the time we finished, I wasn't just legally secure, I was mentally fortified. My son could scheme, beg, manipulate, but it would all crash against walls he couldn't climb. Driving home, I thought back to the years when I would have given anything for a simple phone call, when I would have torn up every legal document just to hear him say, "Dad, I love you." But now I realized love couldn't be begged or bought, and the absence of it had taught me a harder lesson. Self-respect was the one inheritance I could still claim for myself. That evening, as the house grew dark and quiet, I sat in my study with the old family photo album spread out before me. Each picture was a dagger. Birthdays, school plays, Christmas mornings where a smile had once been the only gift I needed. But now I looked at them differently, not with longing but with clarity. Those moments had been real, but they were gone, replaced by 20 years of silence. And what he had shown me at that dinner was that silence had been a choice. I thought again of the way his wife had leaned across the table, asking if I considered letting them help manage things. The nerve of it made my blood boil, but instead of drowning in anger, I let it sharpen my resolve. They thought I was an old man desperate for connection, someone easy to manipulate, someone who would hand over the keys to everything just to sit at their table again. But they had forgotten one thing. I had survived 20 years alone. I didn't need them. They needed me. And now, they would learn what it felt like to want something they could never have. The days that followed were a blur of small but deliberate actions. I visited the bank and restructured accounts, moving funds into protected vehicles. I updated the deed on my house to reflect protections that would prevent any forced transfer. I even called the manager of my investment firm and instructed him, in clear terms, that no access would be given to my son under any circumstances. Each call, each piece of paperwork, gave me a strange kind of peace, as if I were laying bricks in a wall that had been waiting 20 years to be built. At night, though, the hurt still crept in. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the sound of his laughter as a child, the way he used to run into my arms when I came home from work. That ache would never fully leave me, but now it had a new companion: strength. I wasn't a broken father at the mercy of his son's attention anymore. I was a man who had built something real, something earned, and now I was finally claiming the right to protect it. The injustice of it all still burned. 2 decades of silence, erased by a single invitation when money was at stake. But now, instead of drowning me, that injustice fueled me. Each time I remembered the numbers, the sacrifices, the years of loneliness, I felt steadier. He wanted to erase the past, but I wouldn't let him. I carried it like armor, every memory a reminder of what I had endured, and every signature on those documents a promise that I would never let him rob me again. By the end of that week, I wasn't just resolved. I was ready for the calls that would come, ready for the guilt trips, ready for the accusations. He thought he knew me, thought he could manipulate me as easily as he had ignored me. But he was about to find out that the man who raised him wasn't weak. He was about to find out that 20 years of silence had created not desperation, but steel. And for the first time in 2 decades, I didn't dread Christmas. I looked forward to it. Not for reconciliation, not for family, but for the chance to show him exactly who I had become, a man who had learned to live without him, and who would never again let him take what was not his. When the weekend came, the house was quiet enough to hear the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, each swing of the pendulum echoing the rhythm of my own decisions as they settled into place. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my revenge couldn't be loud, at least not yet. It had to be silent, precise, and built on a foundation so strong that when my son finally realized what I'd done, it would already be too late for him to do anything about it. He thought he was holding the reins, thought that his invitation had placed me back into his orbit, that I would orbit around his approval, like a desperate old man begging for scraps of affection. What he didn't know was that I had already stepped off that path and was building a new one, stone by stone, one that led to my own freedom and to his humiliation. The first thing I did was return to the attorney's office on Monday morning. I walked through the door with the same determination I had carried into battle years before, not with weapons, but with resolve. Mark, my attorney, greeted me with a firm handshake and led me back into his office where the smell of leather-bound books lingered. We sat down and reviewed the documents we had started drafting the week before. He spread the papers out on a polished oak desk, tapping them one by one as he explained how each clause locked away my wealth like a fortress with no doors. "This," he said, pointing to the first document, "is the irrevocable trust. Once it's signed, the assets placed inside are no longer technically yours. They're managed by the trustee and distributed exactly as you've outlined, to the grandchildren, to the causes you've chosen. Not even your son can contest it successfully. It takes the inheritance game off the table." I leaned back, the weight of his words sinking in. For so long, I had imagined my money as something that bound me to my son, like chains I couldn't break. But now, with a few strokes of my pen, those chains were turning into shields. I nodded, my voice steady as I said, "Put all in, every dollar, every property, every asset. I want him to know, when the time comes, that he was written out long before he ever asked to be written in." Mark gave a small smile, the kind lawyers give when they see someone finally taking control. We spent 3 hours going line by line, and by the time the signatures were dry, my future had shifted permanently. I had not only secured my wealth, I had made sure my son's hands would never touch it. And I knew deep down that when he finally discovered this, it would cut deeper than any words I could ever say. From there, I moved on to the bank. Walking into the branch felt different this time, not as a customer but as a commander surveying his fortress. The manager, a man in his 40s with nervous energy, ushered me into his office as soon as I explained what I wanted. We went through each account one by one, transferring balances into the trust, adding layers of security, ensuring that no joint access, no power of attorney, no loophole could ever give my son or anyone connected him a path inside. I watched the numbers shift across the screen as a manager typed, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of power humming in my chest. Not the power of wealth itself, but the power of control, the power of knowing that what I had built couldn't be taken from me by manipulation, guilt, or deceit. As we wrapped up, I signed the final forms with a steady hand. The pen didn't shake, the way it sometimes had in the past when I thought about my son. Instead, my grip was firm, and when I slid the paperwork back across the desk, the manager gave me a look of respect. "You've really got this locked down, Mr. Hayes," he said. "Yes," I answered, my voice quiet but unyielding. That's exactly the point. By the time I left the bank, the winter sun had dipped low, and the street lamps were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I pulled my coat tighter around me and walked slowly back to my truck, each step heavy with the knowledge of what I had done. My son thought he was luring me into his game, but in truth, I had already flipped the board. The next step was the house. That old place had seen decades of my life. From the sound of my boy's footsteps racing down the stairs on Christmas morning to the silence that followed after he left for good. It wasn't just wood and brick. It was a piece of me, and I knew he would try to circle it like a vulture if he thought it could one day be his. So I called in a real estate attorney and had a protective deed filed that ensured the property couldn't be sold, transferred, or claimed by anyone but me and, eventually, the grandchildren if I chose. When the paperwork was complete, I stood in the living room, looking at the photos still hanging on the walls, and whispered to myself, "This will never be his. Not now, not ever." And yet, revenge is not only about protection. It is about strategy, about letting the other person think they are winning when, in truth, the floor is falling out from beneath them. So I decided to play along. When my son called a few days later, his voice was smooth, almost cheerful, in a way I hadn't heard in decades. "Dad, just wanted to check in, see how you're doing. Christmas is coming fast. We're really looking forward to having you." I could hear the calculation beneath the warmth, the way he lingered on the word "we," pulling me toward the picture of a family gathering that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with my bank account. I let him talk, asking vague questions about my investments, about whether I'd made smart moves with my sudden wealth. Each time, I answered with just enough detail to keep him interested, but never enough to reveal the truth. Finally, when he circled closer, saying, "Dad, maybe after the holidays we could sit down and look at some opportunities together. Something for the family." I smiled into phone, though he couldn't see it, and said simply, "That sounds good. Let's talk about it after Christmas." He hung up satisfied, his trap baited in his own mind, and I sat in the quiet of my house, the smile fading into something colder, because what he didn't know was that I had already sprung my trap first. By the time the holiday came, every dollar, every property, every asset would be beyond his reach. At night, I sat at my desk writing letters, one to each of my grandchildren. They were too young to understand now, but one day they would. I wanted them to know that their grandfather hadn't been fooled, that he had seen the truth and acted not just for himself but for them, to protect what their father might one day try to steal. Each word I wrote was heavy, but it carried with it a sense of peace. My revenge wasn't just about punishing my son. It was about ensuring that his greed never poisoned the next generation. Still, there was a part of me that longed for him to discover the truth in person, to see his face when he realized what I had done. That was a satisfaction I held on to as the days ticked by, the clock counting down toward Christmas like a drumbeat. I knew the moment would come when the mask would slip, when his rehearsed warmth would turn to anger, when the son who had abandoned me for 20 years would finally understand that I had abandoned him in return, not in silence, but in action. Until then, I played my part. I returned his calls, answered his texts, even allowed myself to sound eager about the holiday dinner. But inside, I was still every word. Every smile was calculated, a performance designed to keep him unaware until the curtain fell. He thought he was clever, but he had underestimated the strength of a father who had survived 20 years of absence. And when the moment came, when the truth was revealed, it wouldn't just sting. It would burn. The first signs of my son's unease came not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet persistence of his calls. At first, They were harmless check-ins, short conversations where he pretended to ask about my health, about whether I was keeping myself busy, about how I was feeling now that we were reconnecting. But as the days moved closer to Christmas, the tone began to shift, and the mask he had worn so carefully started to crack at the edges. One evening, just after dinner, the phone rang. I recognized his number, and though my chest tightened, I answered. His voice came through smooth at first, but there was a slight edge, a demand lingering just beneath the surface. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking. You got a lot on your plate with these investments and everything, and I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Maybe it'd be good if I helped manage some of it. You know, keep things organized for you, just so you don't get taken advantage of." It was a clever choice of words, painting himself as a protector, as though I was some fragile old man incapable of making sound decisions. I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting on the armrest, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before replying. "I appreciate the thought, son, but I've got things handled. Everything's organized just the way I want it." There was a pause, then a forced chuckle. Sure. I just thought, family should look out for each other." "Of course," I said, keeping my tone even, almost warm, though inside I could feel the old bitterness rising. "That's why I'm taking care of things myself. That way nobody gets burdened." The call ended quickly after that, but I could almost hear the frustration in the way he said goodbye, clipped and tight. Over the following week, his efforts grew bolder. He began sending me long text messages, little monologues about family businesses we could start, joint ventures that would set up the next generation. He talked about real estate flips, stock portfolios, even hinted at using my name and credit to secure big moves that could make us both wealthy beyond imagination. I didn't respond to most of them, and when I did, it was with short, dismissive notes. "Let's talk later." Not the right time. Maybe after the holidays. The silence drove him mad. By the third week of December, his calls had turned from charming to desperate. One morning, he left a voicemail that I replayed several times, listening to the way his voice cracked under pressure. "Dad, I don't understand what's going on. I thought we were rebuilding here. I thought we were family again. And now you're shutting me out? I don't get it. I've been trying to include you, trying to bring you back into the fold. What's the problem? Why don't you trust me?" I sat in my chair, the phone in my hand, and for a moment I felt the old ache in my chest, the ache of wanting to leave him, of wanting to reach through the years and rebuild what had been shattered. But then I remembered the cold silence of those 20 years, the unanswered calls, the empty holidays, the sound of clock ticking in an empty house while I ate alone. And just like that, the ache hardened into resolve. He wasn't trying to rebuild anything. He was trying to take. When my silence didn't break him, he changed tactics. The next time he called, his voice was heavy with guilt, rehearsed but sharp. "Dad, you weren't always there for me either. I mean, let's be honest. Maybe the reason I stayed away so long is because you weren't the father I needed you to be. And now, after everything, you want to act like you're in charge? Maybe you owe me something." The words hit hard, like stones flung at an open wound, but instead of breaking me, they fueled me. I kept my voice calm, even gentle, when I replied, "Maybe I wasn't perfect, son. No parent is. But I don't owe you anything. Not one thing. What I gave freely. What I sacrificed, I did because I loved you. If that wasn't enough, that's on you." There was silence on the other end, long and heavy, before he finally muttered, "Fine," and hung up, but he wasn't finished. The retaliation moved outward now, beyond me. He started planting seeds in the family, whispering to cousins and uncles, spinning a tale of how I was losing my mind, how my sudden wealth had clouded my judgment, how I was being reckless with the family's future. Word trickled back to me through a niece, who called one afternoon and asked gently, "Uncle Sam, are you sure you're doing okay? Your son's been saying you're not thinking clearly lately." I sighed, thanked her for her concern, and assured her I was fine, but inside, a slow fire was burning. My son thought he could smear me, thought he could chip away at my dignity, thought he could force me into submission by turning others against me. But he underestimated the patience of a man who had lived 2 decades without his love. I knew how to endure silence, how to weather storms, how to stand firm even when the world tried to convince me I was wrong. The closer Christmas came, the more erratic he became. One night, he showed up at my house unannounced, knocking hard on the door until I opened it. His face was red, his eyes wild with anger, and he pushed his way inside before I could even greet him. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. "Why are you keeping me out? Why won't you let me in? I'm your son." I closed the door quietly behind him and stood still, letting him rant, letting the fury pour out of him like a storm that had been building for years. He paced the living room, his hands shaking, his voice rising and falling as he accused me of betrayal, of selfishness, of abandoning him now that he finally needed me. When he finally stopped, breathing hard, waiting for my response, I looked him in the eye and spoke with a calmness that startled even me. "You left me 20 years ago. You made your choice then. And now you've made it clear again what you're after. I see it, plain as day. You don't want me. You want what I have. And that, son, you will never get." His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood there, trembling with rage, before finally shouting, "You will regret this," and storming out, the slam of the door echoing through the house. I stood in the silence afterward, my heart steady, my hands steady, too. For the first time in decades, I realized I wasn't the one being abandoned anymore. I was the one doing the leaving, and I was doing it on my own terms. But the retaliation didn't end there. Over the next few days, the calls turned vicious. He left messages filled with anger, threats thinly veiled as warnings. He told me I'd die alone, that nobody would care, that my money wouldn't keep me warm at night. Each word was designed to break me, but instead, they strengthened me, because each one proved the truth. His love was gone, replaced by greed, and I had been right to protect myself. By Christmas Eve, I could see it clearly, the desperation, the unraveling, the way his grip was slipping. He had tried charm, guilt, manipulation, and finally fury, and none of it had worked. He was flailing, reaching for a rope that no longer existed. And I was calm, unshaken, steady as the snow that had begun to fall outside my window. The storm was his, not mine. My revenge was already in motion, and he didn't even know it. The moment hung in the air like glass, fragile and sharp, everyone at the table waiting to see if it would shatter under the weight of what I had just said. My son's face burned red, his jaw twitching as he gripped the arms of his chair, trying to muster the authority he once wielded so easily. For years, he had been the loudest voice in every room, the man who set the pace, who chose when to laugh and when to sneer. But now he sat staring at a truth he could not bend, and it was written all over his face that for the first time in his life, he realized power can slip away in an instant. His wife shifted beside him, her manicured fingers tightening around the stem of her glass until the veins in her hand stood out, her eyes darting toward the others seated around the table, calculating whether to intervene or to let him sink alone. My grandchildren sat stiller than I'd ever seen them, forks paused halfway to their mouths, eyes wide as they sensed the gravity of something larger than family dinner. They were too young to understand the intricacies of trust or inheritance, but children can smell conflict the way dogs smell storms, and they knew something irreversible had just happened. I let the silence deepen, because silence can say more than a dozen speeches when you allow it to expand. Then I leaned forward, folded my hands on the table, and I spoke clearly enough that no one could mistake my words. "You said earlier, at the beginning of this night, that family is everything. You raised your glass and spoke about standing together. But for 20 years, I sat alone, year after year, with nothing but the sound of my own breath in an empty room. Not once did you knock at my door. Not once did you pick up the phone to ask how I was doing. Now you invite me here, not for love, not for reconciliation, but because you think I am a vault you can open." He flinched, his mouth opening to form a protest. But I raised my hand slightly, palm outward, and he froze. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every syllable was sharp enough to cut. "That ends tonight. I am not your bank. I am not your last resort when ambition outpaces wisdom. I am your father, and you will treat me with respect or you will not treat me at all." The table crackled with tension. My daughter-in-law inhaled sharply, about to interject with some well-polished line about misunderstanding, but I pressed on before she could interrupt. I did not come here tonight to be manipulated. I came to set things straight, in front of everyone, so there could be no twisting of words later, no rumors spun in kitchens or whispered in phone calls. You all heard his toast. You all saw his hand reaching for what is not his, and now you will all hear this. I reached into my coat pocket, once more, this time pulling out a second set of documents. Their presence was heavy, the kind of weight that comes not from paper, but from permanence. I laid them on the table, sliding them forward until they rested between the centerpiece and his plate. This, I said, is the copy of the trust, signed, sealed, witnessed. The ink is dry. It cannot be undone. Every cent, every asset, every brick and stone is accounted for. My wealth is protected from greed, from manipulation, from false smiles stretched over rotten intentions. You will not see a penny, because you have not earned it. His face twisted, part rage, part disbelief, part a wounded pride that refused to accept what had already been decided. He reached for the papers, but I tapped them with my forefinger before his hand got close. You can read them if you like, but don't think tearing them will change a thing. They are filed. They are binding. They are final. The tension broke like a storm. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling glasses and startling the youngest child into a frightened cry. So, this is what you came for? To humiliate me? To take Christmas dinner and turn it into some twisted performance? You think this makes you a better man? You think throwing money at strangers and skipping over your own blood makes you noble? His words spat like venom, but I did not rise. I simply leaned back in my chair, my voice steady, unwavering. No, what makes me noble is that I endured 20 years of silence from you and still came here willing to listen, willing to give you one chance to show that your invitation was born of love, not greed. What makes me noble is that I have chosen to give my wealth to those who need it, those who will honor it, and to my grandchildren, who deserve opportunities rather than burdens. What makes me noble is that I will not let my legacy be twisted into fuel for your arrogance. The room was silent, except for the sound of the youngest child still sniffling into his mother's sleeve. My son stared at me, his chest heaving, his lips parted as if more words might come, but he had nothing left to say that could mask the truth. His anger was his confession. His silence was his admission of guilt. I turned to the others at the table. I'm sorry that tonight has become uncomfortable, but sometimes the truth makes us uncomfortable. And the truth is that my son invited me here to use me, not to welcome me. I don't regret exposing it. You all deserve to know who I am and who he is. I pushed back my chair and stood, slowly, deliberately. My knees creaked, but my back was straight, and I let them see in my posture that I was not broken, not shamed, not small. I was the tallest I had felt in decades. I took my glass, raised it just slightly, and said, "To the future, a future where dignity matters more than inheritance." I set the glass down without drinking and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard his voice crack as he shouted, "If you walk out now, don't bother coming back." I paused only once, my hand on the frame of the dining room door, and turned my head just enough for him to see the calm on my face. I walked out of your life 20 years ago when you closed the door on me. Tonight, I am simply choosing not to walk back in. The room stayed hushed as I took my coat from the hook, slipped it over my shoulders, and stepped into the cold night. The air was sharp, but was clean, and as I breathed it in, I felt lighter than I had in years. Behind me, the house glowed with light and noise, but none of it belonged to me anymore, and I realized, standing on the snow-covered street, that I did not need it to. The drive home was quiet, the roads nearly empty, the streetlights glowing halos into the night. I thought back on the first Christmas after my wife died, when I had set the table for two and sat staring at the empty chair until my food went cold. I thought of the years after, when I hoped for a phone call that never came. Tonight, I had ended that chapter. I had closed it myself, with my own hand, on my own terms. When I reached my house, I turned off the engine and sat in silence for a long while, the heater ticking as it cooled, the windshield fogging faintly. Then I stepped out, my boots crunching against the fresh snow, and walked up to the door. Inside, the tree lights blinked softly, casting gentle colors against the walls. I hung up my coat, poured myself a small glass of whiskey, and sat down in my favorite chair. The house was quiet, yes, but it was an honest quiet, not the silence of abandonment, not the emptiness of being forgotten, but the peace of a man who had faced betrayal, answered it with dignity, and reclaimed his life. I sipped the whiskey slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through me, and for the first time in years, I smiled without forcing it. They could keep their dinner. They could keep their polished silver and their false toasts. I had kept something far more valuable, my self-respect. And no amount of money, no manipulation, no desperate scheme could ever take that from me again.